Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's free online event by the JFK Peace Speech Committee. We're very pleased to have a very special guest this month, Rabbi Zavis. And we'll do what we always do. We will start by showing a screening of JFK's peace speech, his June 10th, 1963 commencement address at American University. And immediately following the screening of the speech, I will introduce Rabbi Zavis, and she will speak to us for about half an hour, and then we'll have Q&A. And I'll ask folks to please put your questions in the chat. And with that, here comes JFK's peace speech.
In a city devoted to the making of history and to the conduct of the public's business, by sponsoring this institution of higher learning for all who wish to learn, whatever their color or their creed. The Methodists of this area and the nation deserve the nation's thanks. And I commend all those who are today graduating. Professor Woodrow Wilson once said that every man sent out from a university should be a man of his nation as well as a man of his time. And I'm confident that the men and women who carry the honor of graduating from this institution will continue to give from their lives, from their talents, a high measure of public service and public support. There are few earthly things more beautiful than a university, wrote John Masefield in his tribute to English universities, and his words are equally true today. He did not refer to towers or to campuses. He admired the splendid beauty of a university because it was, he said, a place where those who hate ignorance may strive to know, where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see. I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth: peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need them is essential to the keeping of peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient, means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears but we have no more urgent task. Some say that it is useless to speak of peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude towards the possibilities of peace, towards the Soviet Union, towards the course of the Cold War, and towards freedom and peace here at home. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. I am not referring to the absolute, infinite concept of universal peace and goodwill, of which some fantasies and fanatics dream. I do not deny the value of hopes and dreams, but we merely invite discouragement and incredulity by making that our only and immediate goal. Let us focus instead on a more practical, more attainable peace, based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, on a series of concrete actions and effective agreements which are in the interests of all concerned. There is no single simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. With such a peace, there will still be quarrels and conflicting interests, as there are within families and nations. World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance, submitting their disputes to a just and peaceful settlement. And history teaches us that enmities between nations, as between individuals, do not last forever. However fixed our likes and dislikes may seem, the tide of time and events will often bring surprising changes in the relations between nations and neighbors. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. And second, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Soviet Union. It is discouraging to think that their leaders may actually believe what their propagandists write. It is discouraging to read a recent authoritative Soviet text on military strategy and find on page after page wholly baseless and incredible claims, such as the allegation that American imperialist circles are preparing to unleash different types of war, that there is a very real threat of a preventative war being unleashed by American imperialists against the Soviet Union, and that the political aims, and I quote, of the American imperialists are to enslave economically and politically the European and other capitalist countries and to achieve world domination by means of aggressive war, unquote. Truly, as it was written long ago, the wicked flee when no man pursueth. Yet it is sad to read these Soviet statements, to realize the extent of the gulf between us. But it is also a warning to the American people not to fall into the same trap as the Soviets, not to see only a distorted and desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible, and communication as nothing more than an exchange of threats. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other. And no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions of homes and families were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the destruction of this country east of Chicago. Today, should total war ever break out again, no matter how, our two countries will be the primary target. It is an ironic but accurate fact that the two strongest powers are the two in the most danger of devastation. All we have built, all we have worked for, would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. And even in the Cold War, which brings burdens and dangers to so many countries, including this nation's closest allies, our two countries bear the heaviest burdens. For we are both devoting massive sums of money to weapons that could be better devoted to combat ignorance, poverty, and disease. We are both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle, with suspicion on one side breeding suspicion on the other, and new weapons begetting counterweapons. In short, both the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies, have a mutually deep interest in a just and genuine peace and in holding the arms race. Agreements to this end are in the interests of the Soviet Union as well as ours. And even the most hostile nations can be relied upon to accept and keep those treaty obligations, and only those treaty obligations, which are in their own interest. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Third, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Cold War, remembering we're not engaged in a debate, seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment. We must deal with the world as it is, and not as it might have been, had the history of the last 18 years been different. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace, in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace And above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. To secure these ends, America's weapons are non-provocative, carefully controlled, designed to deter, and capable of selective use. Our military forces are committed to peace and disciplined in self-restraint. Our diplomats are instructed to avoid unnecessary irritants and purely rhetorical hostility, for we can seek a relaxation of tensions without relaxing our guard. And for our part, we do not need to use threats to prove we are resolute. We do not need to jam foreign broadcasts out of fear our faith will be eroded. We are unwilling to impose our system on any unwilling people, but we are willing and able to engage in peaceful competition with any people on earth. Meanwhile, we seek to strengthen the United Nations to help solve its financial problems, to make it a more effective instrument for peace, to develop it into a genuine world security system, a system capable of resolving disputes on the basis of law, of ensuring the security of the large and the small, and of creating conditions under which arms can finally be abolished. At the same time, we seek to keep peace inside the non-communist world, where many nations, all of them our friends, are divided over issues which weaken Western unity, which invite communist intervention, or which threaten to erupt into war. Our efforts in West New Guinea, in the Congo, in the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent have been persistent and patient, despite criticism from both sides. We have also tried to set an example for others by seeking to adjust small but significant differences with our own closest neighbors in Mexico and Canada. Speaking of other nations, I wish to make one point clear. We are bound to many nations by alliances. These alliances exist because our concern and theirs substantially overlap. Our commitment to defend Western Europe and West Berlin, for example, stands undiminished because of the identity of our vital interests. The United States will make no deal with the Soviet Union at the expense of other nations and other peoples, not merely because they are our partners, but also because their interests and ours converge. Our interests converge, however, not only in defending the frontiers of freedom, but in pursuing the paths of peace. It is our hope and the purpose of Allied policy to convince the Soviet Union that she too should let each nation choose its own future, so long as that choice does not interfere with the choices of others. The communist drive to impose their political and economic system on others is the primary cause of world tension today. For there can be no doubt that if all nations could refrain from interfering in the self-determination of others, the peace would be much more assured. This will require a new effort to achieve world law, a new context for world discussions. It will require increased understanding between the Soviets and ourselves. An increased understanding will require increased contact and communication. One step in this direction is the proposed arrangement for a direct line between Moscow and Washington to avoid on each side the dangerous delays, misunderstandings, and misreadings of others' actions which might occur at a time of crisis. We have also been talking in Geneva about our first step measures of arms controls, designed to limit the intensity of the arms race and reduce the risk of accidental war. Our primary long-range interest in Geneva, however, is general and complete disarmament, designed to take place by stages, permitting parallel political developments to build the new institutions of peace, which would take the place of arms. The pursuit of disarmament has been an effort of this government since the 1920s. It has been urgently sought by the past 3 administrations. And however dim the prospects are today, we intend to continue this effort, to continue it in order that all countries, including our own, can better grasp what the problems and the possibilities of disarmament are. The only major area of these negotiations where the end is in sight, yet where a fresh start is badly needed, is in a treaty to outlaw nuclear tests. The conclusion of such a treaty, so near and yet so far, would check the spiraling arms race in one of its most dangerous areas. It would place the nuclear powers in a position to deal more effectively with one of the greatest hazards which man faces in 1963, the further spread of nuclear arms. It would increase our security. It would decrease the prospects of war. Surely this goal is sufficiently important to require our steady pursuit, yielding neither to the temptation to give up the whole effort, nor the temptation to give up our insistence on vital and responsible safeguards. I'm taking this opportunity, therefore, to announce 2 important decisions in this regard. First, Chairman Khrushchev, Prime Minister Macmillan, and I have agreed that high-level discussions will shortly begin in Moscow, looking towards early agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty. Our hope must be tempered Our hopes must be tempered with the caution of history, but with our hopes go the hopes of all mankind. Second, to make clear our good faith and solemn convictions on this matter, I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. We will not be the first to resume. Such a declaration is no substitute for a formal binding treaty, but I hope it will help us achieve one. Nor would such a treaty be a substitute for disarmament, but I hope it will help us achieve it. Finally, my fellow Americans, let us examine our attitude towards peace and freedom here at home. The quality and spirit of our own society must justify and support our efforts abroad. We must show it in the dedication of our own lives. As many of you who are graduating today will have an opportunity to do by serving without pay in the Peace Corps abroad or in the proposed National Service Corps here at home. But wherever we are, we must all, in our daily lives, live up to the age-old faith that peace and freedom walk together. In too many of our cities today, the peace is not secure because freedom is incomplete. It is the responsibility of the executive branch at all levels of government, local, state, and national, to provide and protect that freedom for all of our citizens by all means within our authority. It is the responsibility of the legislative branch at all levels, wherever the authority is not now adequate, to make it adequate. And it is the responsibility of all citizens in all sections of this country to respect the rights of others and respect the law of the land. All this is not unrelated to world peace. When a man's way please the Lord, the scriptures tell us, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. And is not peace, in the last analysis, basically a matter of human rights? The right to live out our lives without fear of devastation, the right to breathe air as nature provided it, the right of future generations to a healthy existence. While we proceed to safeguard our national interests, let us also safeguard human interests. And the elimination of war and arms is clearly in the interest of both. No treaty, however much it may be to the advantage of all, however tightly it may be worded, can provide absolute security against the risks of deception and evasion. But it can, if it is sufficiently effective in its enforcement, and it is sufficiently in the interest of its signers, offer far more security and far fewer risks than an unabated, uncontrolled, unpredictable arms race. The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert to try to stop it. But we shall also do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace.
Okay. I'd like to now introduce Rabbi Zavis, give you a little introduction here. And if you have any questions for Rabbi Zavis, please do put them in the chat. Rabbi Zavis is a passionate shaper of Jewish rituals and services that inspire and draw connections between the spiritual, personal, and political. She is a spiritual, social justice activist, attorney, and visionary leader with over 20 years' experience in empathetic and people-centered leadership and collaboration. A sought-after facilitator and trainer in nonviolent communication, prophetic empathy, collaboration, and conflict resolution, Rabbi Zavis has over 25 years' experience working with and helping people understand our shared needs, how to challenge manifestations of othering, and build beloved communities of belonging. As the co-editor of Tikkun magazine, Rabbi Zavis wrote articles and helped shape the magazine. As executive director of the Network of Spiritual Progressives, she has trained over 1,000 people in prophetic empathy and revolutionary love, including me. So I'm now very happy to hear from Rabbi Zavis.
Thank you, Sharon. And thank you, everyone, for having me here today. It's an honor to be with you. So my task today was to try to draw analogies between Kennedy's speech and Jewish values. So I have some thoughts about that. And before I do that, I just want to take a collective deep breath, given what that speech said in the world that we're in today, and also the fallacies of what he said, too. Right? I mean, that speech was after the Bay of Pigs. It was after the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't think there's any real truth in saying that the U.S. has only been pursuing peace, that was only his interest at that time. It may have been in his heart, but it certainly wasn't in the government's actions and never has been. Right? He said, we will not start wars, and yet we've seen us starting wars all over the place. So there's also just like a reality check and a mourning and a grieving about the truth of empire. And that is a transition because the Torah is a critique of empire. in my understanding and reading of Torah and also of Jewish history, we critique empire. We critique the concept that empires should have so much power and control over people's lives. And instead, we talk about building a society of love and justice. So I want to speak to first this idea and concept in the Torah of two worldviews, essentially, because I think Kennedy spoke about this. He spoke about it as the Soviet Union and its evil worldview, and the United States and its benevolent worldview. And these two worldviews, right, are on one hand, a worldview of domination and power over, and on the other hand, a worldview of love and justice. And they're contained in the Torah, and they're contained in Kennedy's speech, and they're contained in all of us because they exist in society. They exist in all of us. At times, we want to exercise and use power and domination, and at times, we are able to sink more deeply into, a worldview where we uplift interdependence and love and justice. And that is prevalent in his speech, and that is a key way of understanding the Torah is a conflict or a tension, let's say, between these two conflicting worldviews. And I think what Kennedy's trying to do in this speech is uplift this worldview of love and justice, which is commendable and beautiful. And in my understanding of the concept of God, not as this big man in heaven, but a more theological approach, is that God, for lack of a better word, the divine, is this force in the universe that makes possible a transformation from that which is to that which can and ought to be. And so Kennedy said in his speech, we, all of these systems and structures are created by human beings, he says, man, and we can change it. And that is very, very prevalent in the Torah, that the systems and structures of oppression and domination, the way it's talked about in the Torah, are not fundamental to the structure of the universe itself. In other words, they are not fundamental to the rising and setting of the sun. They are not fundamental to the flow of rivers and oceans. They are not fundamental to the natural flow of the life of the universe, of the ecological systems and structures. And they are social and political and economic systems created by human beings. And as Heschel said, God is in search of man or human beings. And what that means is that force in the universe that moves toward more justice, right? As MLK said, the arc of the universe bends towards justice. That force requires human action and human intervention. Otherwise, it's not just going to happen. That is not part of the nature of the universe, that it's just going to naturally arise. If human beings have created injustice, then human beings need to be involved in transforming injustice into justice. And that's one of the calls within Judaism. And Kennedy talked about it on two levels, both the internal and the external. In Judaism, we talk about it as tikkun hanefesh, the healing, transforming, and repairing of our own inner souls, our beings, and tikkun ha'olam, the healing, repair, and transformation of the world. And often, and I like the way he did this, because often in many religious, spiritual traditions, we focus on the self. We're going to transform ourselves, and then eventually that'll transform the world. And yet, when we live in a society of injustice, a society of oppression, of a sense of not enoughness, of scarcity and greed, then tikkun hanefesh, the inner work, cannot happen unless we also transform the world, because they're interconnected. So we have to do both simultaneously. We have to work on transforming ourselves at the same time that we work on transforming the world. And both of those inform each other. As I transform myself, I'm more equipped to effectively transform the world. As the world transforms, my own inner self naturally transforms, because I can trust more fully in the fact that we actually can have a world of love and justice. When we have a world like we do now, where things that we've taken for granted, Social Security, healthcare to some extent in our country, but some modicum of a safety net. When those things are ripped from us, then our fear increases. So then we move toward the worldview of fear and away from the worldview of love and justice, right? So where we are on that continuum between those two worldviews, excuse me, depends on what's happening in the world outside of us as well as within ourselves. So as long as we're living in a world where there's more scarcity, there's more injustice, there's less sense that we will actually be okay, the more we're going to turn toward fear and toward domination to ensure our security and safety, personally and collectively. So that's part of what we're seeing here is that choice of where do we land on that continuum and how do we navigate that in our personal and our collective lives. Another thing he spoke about was this tension between pursuit of war and pursuit of peace. In Judaism, the way I talk about that is to choose life. The Torah says over and over again, choose life, not death. You have a choice. You can choose life or you can choose death. And Kennedy here is speaking to that, I believe. He's saying choosing peace means choosing life. And as I mentioned, Torah and Jewish history is a critique of the choice of death, of the choice of empire and violence and war. And the rabbis constantly rejected the idea of violence. So, for example, in the Torah, it talks about the death penalty. And it talks about stoning to death and all these really awful things. And the rabbis say, in particular, about if you have a wayward son, then that son shall be stoned to death. And the rabbis say, oh, what that means is, that would never happen. That could never happen. They basically wash it away. And then in terms of the death penalty, they say essentially any nation that imposes the death penalty is a morally corrupt nation. You can't impose it. So they very much uplift a Torah of nonviolence. And part of the reason that they do that is because Rabbi Akiba and others in the Bar Kokhba revolution stood up to the Romans and spoke out against it and fought against it violently and nonviolently. And the rabbis saw what happened, which was all of the people who stood up were slaughtered. And so out of a sense of purely self-survival of the Jewish people, they rejected violent revolution and revolution as a whole. So it became less revolutionary, whereas the Torah itself is truly revolutionary, right? Like the story of Exodus itself is the story of the possibility of transformation. And it requires, in the story of Exodus, if you remember or are aware of the story, Moses tells the Hebrews to kill the Egyptian animal that they worship, to slaughter it, and then put its blood on their doorpost. That's where you get the mezuzah on the doorpost. You put the blood on the doorpost, and then the angel of death won't come, and you'll be safe, and then we'll get to leave Egypt. And that act required both individual actions, right? Each person themselves had to have some level of faith and trust that if they killed this animal that's sacred in Egypt, that would actually be safe. And it required individuals to do it, and it required the collective to do it. And so that's where this idea of the possibility of transformation really comes in our Torah really profoundly. We're choosing to reject the belief that the Pharaoh rules with what's the word I'm looking for? With the authority of God, right? It's a rejection of that belief and a belief in human capacity to create a different future. So those are some thoughts. And then I want to talk a little bit about peace, because he talks a lot about peace, and he says, what kind of peace am I talking about, and what does it mean? So in Hebrew, the word for peace is shalom, right? Which also means wholeness, like a completeness. And in Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the ancestors, there's a saying that says, the foundation of the world rests on three things: truth, justice, and peace. So I've reflected on that a lot in the last, since October 7th in particular. Um, and the way that I have come to my drash on this, if you will, my take on this, is that the order of those matters. So we think of it like a triangle, right? Like triangles are very strong, and so the world requires all three. But I don't think I think it matters what order it's in. And what I mean by that is I don't think you get peace without justice, and I don't think you get justice without truth. And so part of what matters is how we do that. And so we need to be willing to unpack and speak truth and to really look at the history and what's happened and understand what are the I mean, he talked about in Russia the propaganda lies, I'm watching, and I'm sure all of you are watching the propaganda lies unfold in Israel and here about what's happening and what's happened since October 7th and before October 7th. And we're not going to get to peace. There's not going to be peace unless we actually go back and look at what's happened historically and what the truth is. And there may be disputes about that, but there are some fundamental truths. And we need to unpack those and talk about those. And then we need to create justice from there. And that requires teshuvah. That requires, in Judaism, teshuvah means repairing, transforming, healing, reparations. It requires not repeating the same mistakes over and over again. It's all of these steps. It's part of what we focus a lot on during the high holiday season. And you can't have justice unless you have those elements. You need to do reparations and repairs and reset the systems and structures of a society so that there is, in fact, justice. And then from there, you can get peace. And he actually spoke about that a bit because he said the strong need justice. In other words, they need to be just. But without truth and justice, there is no peace. There's peace for some, right? There's a fallacy of peace for those with power, but there's not an actual peace because there's no wholeness, because there's actually brokenness and injustice. What else do I want to say about his talk? Give me 1 second. Just look at some of my notes that I took. I want to talk a little bit here about this way that power and domination is so used and weaponized, because he tries to challenge that. And I find it ironic because, of course, the U.S. has never actually given up its power and domination. It's happy to be the strongest empire in the universe, wielding its power and violence throughout the world. And we saw that when we saw that really powerfully, right, with the attacks on Iran. And we really need to question, and he is questioning, like, if we can really have peace if we have that power, but he still wants to hold on to that power, right? He still wants the U.S. If we have our weapons, then the world will be safe, but no one else can have those weapons. Well, I think, unfortunately, what the countries that don't have nuclear weapons learned by the attack in Iran is to get nuclear weapons, because that's actually what's going to protect you, because they wouldn't have attacked. That's certainly one lesson that can be learned from that. And he's trying to say, well, we can have these weapons. We'll not use them so much, but other countries shouldn't have them. And I mean, it's interesting. It would be fun. It would be a fun exercise to actually sit down with Kennedy as Kennedy, not as the president, and to really understand where his heart was at. Because, of course, as a president, there's a lot of different tensions being pulled, right? Different interests pulled at him, and he doesn't have total power to enact what he wants, perhaps, but because he seems to want to move to a world of peace, but he's still living in and ruling the strongest nation in the world, and that is an incredible tension, right? An incredible challenge, and I'd be curious where his true heart was. I mean, the speech was really beautiful because you could hear um, threads of his regret, even perhaps, about some of the actions he engaged in and some of the actions the United States engaged in. And you can maybe understand why the powers that be wanted him dead, because maybe he really was trying to push the movement of our society toward true peace and not power and domination, toward a worldview of love and justice, and away from a worldview of domination and power over. Um, but as president of an empire, that's extremely hard to do. And I think that's why the Torah was really critical of the empire. So Samuel wanted a king. The people were crying out about wanting to have a king, a ruler, a leader like all the other nations. And God's like, no, no, we're not going to do that. That's not a good thing to do. And they fought and fought, and finally God gave in. And then God said, okay, if you're going to have a king, you're going to have somebody within the king's central group of people who remind him of the Torah, and not only remind him of the Torah, but every day he's supposed to read the Torah, so that you remember that the key teachings are to love the stranger, to care for the other, that the Torah teaches that the land is God's. The land is owned by divine. Human beings don't own land. We're mere sojourners on this earth. And so it's really in the Torah, there's really, I mean, it's an interesting thing to say, but in some ways there is this deep connection between the state and ethical values, let's say, religious ethical values. And in some ways, there isn't going to be the separation. If you're going to be a king, you're going to turn to the Torah to remind you of these key teachings of our tradition. And while I certainly want separation of church and state, I would like an ethical government that actually did turn to some key ethical principles about how we live our lives and how we create a society. Because Judaism, there's some amazing bird sounds here. I just have to say, it's really spectacular. Because Judaism is really about how you build society. It's not nearly as much about how we live our individual lives. It's that too, because that informs and impacts how we build society. But Judaism is about a we. It's about how we build a society that is loving and welcoming for the other and the stranger. So if you find a dead person on the outside of your society, your town, you have a responsibility to take that dead person and find out what happened and take care of them. And so it's otherwise your society becomes corrupt. And I think that's part of what he was speaking to, right? That we need to create a society that's loving and just. And we're certainly far away from that today, which for me is quite heartbreaking. So I know I've got a little bit more time, but I think I'll stop there and perhaps weave some of these other thoughts in as we're talking. So I think it's going to be more interesting to have conversation. So I haven't looked at the chat at all, but now.
Okay. Yeah, we do have some questions in the chat. And thank you for your thoughts and your comments on the speech and how, we can relate to it, you know, from Judaism. Anyway, let me see. We have some questions here. Steve Engel asks, how could the arguments in the Torah against empire and death be used to counter the current ideologies of total destruction that we see from figures like Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, or Smotrich?
Yeah, so there's lots of it's a really great question, and like makes me want to like pull out all my notes from my teachings and all of this each week when I do Torah discussions and analyze things through that very lens. But we really have to look at different teachings in the Torah and the Torah stories and unpack them through this question and through this lens. And what does it mean when you're creating a society, what the Torah is telling us is you have a responsibility. It's not that you are better than, right? So there's this argument in a previous parsha recently, the parsha on Korach, where Korach says to Moses, "What gives you all this power? Who the hell do you think you are?" Like God, we're all created in the image of the divine, and then there's this test, and the earth swallows up Korach and the other challengers. But the question I like to ask for that wasn't Korach's question a valid question? Like, of aren't we all creating the image of the divine? And what makes one more worthy to be a ruler than the other? And what does it mean to be a ruler? And how do we rule justly and kindly? And Moses, of course, is talked about as like the most humble person and the best prophet and leader ever. And if we look at the Torah, Moses screwed up a zillion times. He couldn't get into the promised land because he used violence hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock like God told him. And so we have to pull from the Torah the ways in which empire is critiqued and challenged and use it to criticize what Israel's doing today. And there's nothing in Torah. I mean, the Torah teaches, you don't destroy trees when you take a land. The stranger in your land is one with you. They are entitled to the same protections and laws. You're supposed to love the stranger, care for the vulnerable, create a just society. So the question is less about how do you use those values and more about the political will to use those values, right? Because Netanyahu's secular, but he'll manipulate the Torah and talk about Amalek, right, who killed all the Jews, and we should, quote, never forget Amalek. What does that mean? He's saying that means we have to wipe out the Palestinians. That's not what the Torah meant. But there's certainly the argument that that's what it meant, and certainly some of the religious Jews, even within the religious movement in Israel, the different religious sects or groups, some are completely anti-Zionist and they're protesting, and others are fully Zionist and believe in the nation state and support it and support the slaughter of Palestinians and the genocide. So this is where that tension that I talked about the two worldviews comes in. And our job is to uplift the teachings in the Torah that talk about love and justice and turn to love and justice as the answer. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, Stephen, but it touches upon it to the best of my effort in this moment. You can, I do, if you want more details, like you can go on to our website and listen to some of my teachings, because each week I give a drash that does tease out, I basically am critiquing what's happening most every week here and obviously in Israel and in Palestine. So, but the challenge is more like right now, the voice of domination and power over is the prevalent voice in the world, in most governments in the world, and certainly in the United States and in Israel. And Kennedy's trying to move us toward a government of love and justice. I would have loved for him to start out and say, I'm saying this because I've reflected upon the mistakes that I've made. That actually would have been a more powerful, and then went on. But that actually would have said to people, we've done this. We've screwed up. We've used domination and power over. We go in and overthrow governments that are aligned with communism because they're not in our interest. Because actually what he's saying in some ways is a lie. It's hard to listen to it and fully, respect what he's saying when you know what really happened. You can look back and be like, So I hope that touches upon it a bit, Stephen. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, you wonder how much, what he said, like he said, the United States will never start a war. Did he really believe that? At the time he said that, I don't know. We can look at it now and roll our eyes, you know. But I don't know if he maybe actually believed that at the time. Anyway, let's see. Oh, Gerald Belsky has a question here. If the creative force in the universe requires man to change the world for justice, What do you think of ending the system of empire as proposed by the BRICS and as implied in the American Declaration of Independence, which would require a new security and development order? Want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, to the best of my capacity. I don't think any nation state has a right to exist. I mean that's not the teaching in the Torah that nation states have a right to exist. People have a right to exist. Societies are created to ensure the well-being, security, safety, thriving of humanity. There's nothing in the Torah that says nations should be thriving and have a right to exist. In fact, it's the exact opposite. The Torah says if you create a nation state that oppresses, that kills, that doesn't care for the needy and the stranger and the other, you will in fact be wiped off the face of the earth. That's what the prophets rage about. They rage and rage at the Jewish people, at the Hebrews, the Jewish people, because they didn't create a just society. And we saw what happened. We were exiled. And so that's, yeah, I mean, societies only exist, should only exist for the well being of the people. So, how do we create a world? What would be the best systems and structures we could create for a thriving world? I was driving home the other day when I was still in California, past all these stores and apartments and houses, and I was thinking to myself, why is anything privately owned? Why isn't everything publicly owned? Now, then, of course, I thought, well, God, if it was all publicly owned under Trump, it would be a mess. Ideally, if we could create a world where there was systems and structures to ensure the public ownership of everything that was always done in a just way through smaller local management and so on and so forth, you could create an entirely different world. Nation states are not necessary for the security and the well-being of the world. And in fact, it looks like maybe they're actually perhaps harmful for the well-being of the world. And then, of course, we have to look at the uh, influence, impact. It's not even influence, the impact of corporations on all of this, which are essentially almost nations at this point, nation states at this point with their level of influence. But yeah, I don't have any problem saying that nation states and empires need to fail. And in fact, we're watching it fail. It's going to be ugly and awful. But I think they're failing.
Yeah, to me, it seems like, ego is way out of balance with spirit. That's the way it feels to me.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good way to put it.
Faisal Mansour, who is one of our regular members from Sri Lanka, has a question. He asks, in pre-colonial Sri Lanka, our ancestors held that since no one can know what it is like to be anyone else,
Mm.
society exists as a safe space for self-discovery, with the only caveat being that one's self-discovery must not infringe on anything else's or maybe anyone else's. Um, so hence, ahimsa means non-hurt. That comes from himsa, which means hurt. Does this have a reflection in the Torah?
That's beautiful. Wouldn't that be a beautiful world? Um, well, there is the concept of nonviolence in the Torah, and certainly in the rabbis. So, yeah, this idea of caring for oneself. But I think what's interesting in the Torah is it really does focus on interdependence. And I'm not saying that that concept that you just spoke about doesn't, but it's less about individual. Judaism is really less about individuality and more about interconnectedness. So um, we pray and we connect with the divine to find our deepest souls and manifest ourselves in alignment with the teachings. And it's always about interconnectedness. So I think yes, and and there's a slight perhaps variation, at least from the way it was articulated in the question. But certainly, there's nothing in the Torah that would say um, self revelation, self-understanding is harmful unless it is, right? And then that's when it comes in. But the idea is that we care for, that's where tikkun ha-nefesh and tikkun ha-olam, right? The healing, repair, and transformation of our souls, of ourselves, and of the world.
Uh, Let me see. I had another question here. Okay. Yeah. Mike Caggiano asks, he says, it seems like Iran and their supreme leader follows your Torah model. What do you think of that?
That's an interesting question because I was thinking about that. I mean, I don't think overall they follow the Torah model. They're slaughtering people and oppressing people and doing all sorts of things. I think that, and I don't know enough about them either to speak. It does seem that they, in terms of responding in this, the attacks on their nation and the threats to their nation, that they're more cautious and deliberate, and than Israel and the United States certainly were. It seems like they are trying constantly to avoid escalation because, of course, because they know the outcome of escalation for their country, but I don't know that they've created a society that honors, the humanity and dignity of each person. So going back to the previous question about, recognizing each person's capacity to express themselves, right? We would call that perhaps human dignity, which is a big thing in the Torah, respecting the human dignity of each person, because each person is created in the image of the divine. But if each person is created in the image of the divine, then you don't kill them because they disagree with you. The Torah is filled with debates. That's why there's two worldviews in the Torah. In one sentence you can hear one thing, in the other sentence you can hear the opposite. And the Talmud is a compilation of different perspectives and beliefs and understandings and interpretation of Torah. So dispute and disagreement is in the heart of Judaism. So I don't want to say that they're following the Torah's model, but it's been interesting to watch.
What is it they say? Like if you have six Jews in a room, you have at least 12 opinions or something like that.
Right, unless of course you're talking about being an anti-Zionist, and then you're not a Jew.
Oh, yeah. Mm. Frank,
Right, except now you don't get to have diverse opinions on this one. Judaism and Zionism is one and the same, which of course is not the case, but
not the case at all. No.
no, never has been.
Oh boy, it's such a tough time to deal with this. Frank Arisa asks, can you talk about the three monotheistic religions and how we are all connected, and the meaning of thou shalt not kill, which I think actually may translate more accurately to thou shalt not murder?
Yeah. Um, so I'm not quite, yeah, I can try to talk to the first part of that, which is, Abraham as the father of all three religions and the belief in one one God, one being, one divine source for all. And in in all of the religions, to my knowledge, there's an understanding that all of us are interconnected. That so in I'll speak to Judaism because that's the one I know the best. um, it the belief that human beings are created in the image of the divine is not unique to only Jews. All human beings are created in the image of the divine. Every human being, and we're all interconnected. So there's the Kabbalistic mystical story of the vessel that contained the divine energy, and then that divine light was so strong, so powerful, it could no longer be contained in a vessel, so it shattered into broken pieces, and these broken pieces became the universe, all of it, all of us, everything. And so we're all part of this divine. We're all part of the divine, and the divine is more than us. And all the religions, all the different belief systems in the world are part of the wholeness of it all. So there is this interconnectedness. And that's really my understanding of what the Shema is. Really like the main, one of the main things that we say 3 times a day, Shema Yisrael, is don't forget that we're all part of the whole. And then, yeah, that it's thou shall not murder. And then, that's where I talk about the rabbis go into long interpretations to make sure that we're talking about really narrowing that. And if any nation carries out the death penalty, then they are not a just nation. And many times in the Torah, it'll say, if you do X, Y, or Z, you'll be killed. You'll be put to death, or they shall put you to death. But really, when you read the Hebrew, what it's really translating is the way it's really translated is, you shall surely die. It's not that people will kill you. It's that you shall surely die. And the way I understand that, and many other people understand that, is that when you engage in acts that are so unaligned with human worth and value, let's say, that are so harmful, that a part of your soul dies and you lose connection with your people. You go into exile from your connection with the divine and your people. So I hope that answers the question to some extent.
Marty Schatz asks, in your opinion, is Zionism fundamentally at odds with Jewish tradition as you understand it?
So I want to draw a distinction between political Zionism and cultural or spiritual Zionism. So political Zionism is what we're seeing today in the creation of a nation state that is about Jewish supremacy. Right? Political Zionism requires both the prevalence of Jews living on the land, vis-a-vis the Palestinian, the indigenous population, and it requires Jewish supremacy. That to me is not aligned with Judaism. But the concept of a spiritual political Zion, of a nation, Yisrael, of a people being connected with one another, caring for each other, that to me is not inherently contradictory to a nation state that could welcome all people. Zionism didn't, as a political entity, required a nation state, but a desire to return to a land that you believe you have roots connected to it, that has meaning to you, is not inherently a negative or it doesn't have to inherently be oppressive. Palestinian and Jews were living peacefully in that land and in many Arab nations before the establishment of Zionism and the state.
Yeah, I just want to say, your background is in nonviolent communication, going from back when I first met you, um, back when you were when you were living in my neck of the woods in Washington State, and using nonviolent communication as an attorney. And I just want to ask you about the cycle of violence that we're seeing. I've listened to people like Gabor Mate. I really appreciate what he has to say about trauma. And I'm just curious what your thoughts in how, even at this awful point that we've gotten to, can we find a way to stop the cycle of violence and really focus on the people that are actively doing healing work and have been doing healing work.
Yeah. So, I mean, Gabor Mate is, of course, wonderful. The Torah talks about the fact that the harm that we create will be carried on for 3 to 4 generations within us, but justice and goodness will carry on for thousands of generations. And it's interesting because we now know that's true, right? That there's intergenerational trauma that lives within us genetically. And we are enacting a trauma on the Palestinian people that's going to be carried on for generations and generations and will not ever create peace. Um, and the only way to get us there is to do the teshuvah and to change the society in the way things are happening. So, yeah, I mean, I have spoken a lot about the Jewish trauma and the way that it's being weaponized to justify and explain what's happening. And also to then, I mean, when the murders happened in DC and Boulder, the way that Jewish trauma was centered in the face of a genocide was really horrifying to witness. Not to say that those acts weren't horrible and traumatizing, but I saw Jewish organizations, write these long pieces and about how awful this is and how it's anti-Semitic, and I'm like, I don't know that we don't know it's anti-Semitic. We don't know that. We know that some Jews were killed, and one person wasn't Jewish, and it's terrible, and it's not okay. But we actually don't know what the motivation was of these people. Um, and yet Jewish trauma was really centered. And then some Muslim organizations wrote these beautiful statements about no matter what's happening with the genocide, this is not okay. We cannot do this. And then the Jewish groups were so grateful that the Muslims wrote these letters, these statements. Those same Jewish organizations have not written one statement about the genocide. They've rarely called for a ceasefire. So it's, we keep, I like to say that there's a teaching in Torah about the fact that you create a fence around the Torah. And what that means is you create a protective shield, let's say, so that the core teachings of the Torah are protected. So you expand, this is where halakha, the laws, come in. You expand the laws to protect the center. So you create more restriction, essentially, in some ways you could think of it, to protect the core teachings or to protect the core values. And I really think what we've done is we have removed the fence around the core teachings of Torah, and we've wrapped ourselves or infenced ourselves, if you will, in our trauma. And it's like we're in a straitjacket. And we have to disentangle that. We have to do our healing work. And we have to be willing to honestly look at what we've done and who we've become. And that's not easy work. So I can have compassion for the fact that those of us who were raised believing all sorts of Islamophobic and anti-Arab racist views and stories about the land without a people for a people without the land, and Arabs don't value life as much as Jews, and blah, blah, blah. Those of us who were raised with that, we have to look at that. And that's hard to do. And so those of us who can help other people do that need to hold a space for that unraveling with kindness and compassion and empathy. But challenging it, we have to do. We have to reject this Jewish supremacy. We have to reject that Jewish trauma is somehow so prevalent that it's more relevant than a genocide and ethnic cleansing that we're witnessing today.
Yeah, so horrifying that this is being done with U.S. weapons. I sat here in the U.S. for years saying, I can't deal with the conflict that's going on in Israel-Palestine. I think they're just going to ultimately destroy each other. And now I don't feel that way. I feel like I have to speak up. I have to speak up because our country is so complicit in that. And I think about what JFK would think about everything that's going on right now and how relevant that speech is today in light of that. And I really appreciate that this group exists, that we can say, hey, the sitting president once gave this incredible peace speech and it's as relevant as it was 62 years ago. Just, oh man.
Yeah.
Oh. Anyway, okay. So Todd Pierce, there's been some talk in the chat about the origins of the nation state. And Todd says, the national conservatives assert that he's responding to someone else's comment here, but he says the national conservatives assert that even international law is a form of imperialism, echoing the Nazi Carl Schmitt. Any thoughts on why there is not more alarm over such fanatical right-wing ideas being carried out in front of our eyes as we speak here, with too many people falling for the ruse that they are for peace, though giving unlimited support for ours and Israel's war?
Kind of a rhetorical question, right? um, I mean, I think there is quite a lot of alarm about the rise of fascism in this country, and um, and still the Democratic Party is frighteningly silent and, in my mind, complicit. And this is where I think um, the we're really seeing the danger of the conflation of money and power, and and Citizens United and we're basically being run by corporations. That's how decisions are being made, right? War is, as Francesca Albanese did in her most recent report, war is good business. It's a good business model. Um, if your business model is to make a lot of money, and so I mean, we don't have the political will or the political power as peace activists, as justice seekers in this nation or in the world yet. And so we're going to continue to see, um, I always say, empire doing empire or business models doing business models. And yeah, I mean, I think this is where you also, I mean, the Zionist propaganda machinery is powerful and brilliant. There's a really good movie. It's a four-part series. Um, you can find it on YouTube. So Al Jazeera created it, and it was about the movie or something. I'll try to look it up. That Israeli lobby doesn't want you to see, and it's about the impact and maneuvering of the Israeli lobby. And it was originally first done about Britain, and um, Britain used its power to. It was created by Al Jazeera to silence it. So Al Jazeera never released it. Al Jazeera sent a Jewish Al Jazeera reporter into the Israeli lobby, and they infiltrated it very powerfully. And it's it's amazing. And so I think that when I engage in, which I do very, very limited, debates with people on Facebook about some of the lies about Israel and what's happening, you can just hear their talking points come back, and the lies, oh, if only they release the hostages, this war in Gaza would stop. What, like it's as if we're living in two different worlds. So I think that's really the challenge, and I think that's part of the work that I was doing before I became the rabbi at Beit Tikkun, was in the network of spiritual regressive trainings, where I tried to help people on the left understand how we need to speak on the left so that we're not demeaning and putting down people who aren't yet with us. We tend to call them racist, sexist, homophobic, or just plain ignorant and stupid. I mean, even Kennedy talked about the ignorance, we which we can understand, but there's probably a less shaming way of referring to people who don't agree with us than calling them ignorant. Maybe they don't have the level of historical knowledge that would be helpful for them to make decisions that are more life-serving. That's a little gentler, you know. Um, so I think that's the hard work. That's the hard work of us, is how do we continue. And I'm not talking about like extremist MAGA people or extremist people in businesses. And I'm talking about like people who could really be moved, people who have bought into some of these lies, people more in the center, even the center left, right? I mean, there's a whole thing in the Jewish world about progressive and everything, but Palestine, oh no, even in that group, how do we move people um, to have a more honest critique of what's happening? And that's where I think prophetic empathy, challenging people with empathy, but also with the prophetic voice and value of the world that we want, can start to helpfully move us toward the world we want. I don't have. It's a hard time. We're living in very hard times.
It is a very hard time, and I find it helpful to reflect on things that have been said, like in Kennedy's speech. What he said in that June 10th, 1963 speech was quite revolutionary. I think he was actually talking in spiritual terms. He was talking about encouraging people to self-reflection, empathy, what's going on in us, what's motivating us. And when I read Rabbi Michael Lerner's book, The Left Hand of God, that really opened my eyes to how we communicate in such a way that really does not connect with people. It actually repels people, and how we need to learn the language of connection, and revolutionary love is completely along those same lines. And just last night, I attended, this was a remarkable thing. I'm involved with the Washington State Democrats, and last night they had a seminar about why we're not connecting with the right and why there's this rural and urban divide. And what they were saying is like, yeah, I learned this 20 years ago. And I learned it, I learned about AIPAC 20 something years ago at a Tikkun conference in DC, and that's when I learned that my congressman was going to Israel with a congressional delegation, and they weren't meeting with any grassroots peace organizations that I knew existed. So, what's really going on there?
Yeah, I put in the chat the link to the Israeli lobby movie that I just mentioned.
Oh, thank you. Great.
That's freely available on YouTube for folks who might be interested.
Yeah,
It's a
thank
four-part series. They're
you.
short, they're like 40 minutes or something each.
Yeah. Oh, Faisal Mansour is asking, what do you have any thoughts on Francesca Albanese being sanctioned by the U.S.?
I haven't read enough about that to fully understand what that means and the impact of that. I don't think she cares unless she has assets in the United States that are going to be frozen, and then she might care. I mean, her life's being threatened, her family's being threatened. So sanctions from the United States. I mean, she doesn't hold the United States on a pedestal. She doesn't. She's been incredibly critical of the UN and its in unwillingness and inability to do anything. And so, I mean, she's a hero, right? I mean, she's just a total hero. And so it's just another example of the truth of what the international UN and its mechanisms really are about, right? Which is really about to protect Western white nations and and to ensure the perpetuation of Western power. I mean, so it's horrific because we thought that these institutions were there to actually protect human life and people, but they're not. They're there to protect power. It's empire again. It was the winners making the laws and making the decisions, and they're using their power and might. We live in a world where might and power makes right, quote unquote. It's not really makes right, but makes the decisions, and so it's despicable. Um, but is it any more disgraceful than everything Biden has done and did? No. He never stopped this. So I don't think she cares, is my suspicion. Like, she's just fearless.
Well, we need some fearless people, don't we?
Yeah, thank God.
Yeah, or people who are willing to put their fears aside to speak truth.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, we have got just a minute left here. I just want to thank everybody
I
who
see a
came.
hand. I see a hand raised. I don't know if you want to.
We haven't been taking
Okay.
people because
Okay.
we have such a limited amount of time.
Okay.
That's
Great.
why I asked people to put questions in the
I
chat.
can
It's
look at your
been quite a
question in the.
lively discussion in the chat. I just want
Yeah.
to let folks know that next month we're going to be featuring veteran peace activist and founder of the Center for Policy Alternatives, Dr. Saravanamut. I'm sorry, I gotta get this right. Saravanamutu.
Nail.
Dr. Saravanamutu. Okay. And the center seeks to establish transparency in government. Dr. Saravanamatu helped establish Transparency International in Sri Lanka and is often called upon to be part of the international election monitoring, especially in Asia. So that should be very interesting. I want to thank Rabbi Kat Zavis so much for being with us today, even from halfway around the world from where she lives, and appreciate your thoughts at this very fraught time.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you all for your work and care.
Thank you very much. Have a good night, everyone, and hope to see you next month. And please stay in touch. Safe
Bye-bye.
travels.
Peace. Yep.
Safe travels, Pat.
Bye-bye.
How's that spelled?
Huh?
How does that spell? Zavis. Cat Zavis.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.